Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session with Dr. Louisa Moats. We could not be more excited to learn from her, and we are so grateful for her time today. I want to let you know we've got so many attendees joining us today that we are actually at full capacity for this event platform. So we've set up a simulcast on YouTube. If you encounter any glitches here, there's going to be a YouTube link in the Q&A, so you can go there and view the live stream. All of today's sessions are being recorded and will be available for replay right here as soon as the session ends. And I'm so excited to briefly introduce Dr. Moats. Dr. Moats has been a teacher, psychologist, researcher, graduate school faculty member, and author of many influential scientific journal articles, books, and policy papers on the topics of reading, spelling, language, and teacher preparation. Welcome, Dr. Moats. We are so glad to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here and to be able to talk with so many of you in far-flung places. I myself am in the middle of the state of Idaho, where we have a long snowy winter. And it gives me a lot of time to think about our present situation with regard to reading instruction and to observe the debates and issues that come up. And more, I come back to this basic idea that I'm going to be talking about today that is underappreciated and underpracticed, which is that print is a reflection of spoken language. And what we need to do in order to refine our practices is to get away from the idea that reading and spelling are primarily, quote, visual activities, as shows up in a lot of reading programs and advisories, and instead substitute the term visual with the term language. So that is the basic idea that I'll be explicating over the next quarter, 3/4 of an hour. So first I want to point out the obvious, which is that human speech or human language preceded print by a long period. Spoken language, we think, evolved perhaps 100,000 years ago or so. The first writing systems, however, were invented approximately 10,000 years before the modern age. And the first writing systems were logographic. They didn't even reflect the sound systems of language. And alphabetic writing is a very late human achievement. Alphabetic writing systems came into existence perhaps about 5,000 years ago, depending on which ones you point to. But the main idea is that these were a very late human achievement, and there's something inherently unnatural and difficult and separate about alphabetic writing in relation to human speech. So now in the great wide world, we have at least 5 major alphabets and then others that are not even represented here. And you can see, of course, that they look different. They have a different number of symbols. They go in different directions. And they have one thing in common, which is they are invented to represent sound segments in spoken language. So in our writing system in English, we have representations of phonemes that are rather complex that I'll be coming to in a moment. But my first question for all of you is, what is your definition of a phoneme? What is a phoneme? Let's get that straight first. Is it a letter or letter group that represents a single sound, as I read in various places? Is it any identifiable, quote, speech bit that is detectable in spoken words? Or is it the smallest unit of sound and speech that can change the meaning of a word? What's the right answer here? Well, if you selected number 3, you were correct. And one of the underappreciated aspects of the definition of a phoneme is that it is a unit of sound or a building block in a language system that can change the meaning of a word. So one way to illustrate this is that all of these words, beat, bit, bait, bet, bat, bite, bot, but, bought, boot, butte, bow, boy, burr, barn, bore, have different vowels in them, and that is one way that we know what the vowel sounds of English are, because when you change bot to bought, you've made two different words. That is, you've created linguistic objects or entities that have different meanings. So another basic concept, besides what a phoneme is, if we're to have a discussion about this, is what is a grapheme. And this, too, is an underappreciated and undertaught aspect of the English writing system, and the basis for its complexity, or one main reason for its complexity, and that is that graphemes in English can be 1, 2, 3, or 4 letters, as in our representations for the I vowel in pilot, pie, high, and height, or in slow, so, slow, joke, bow, though. And let's look at the last couple of lines. The U in mutant, mute, few, euphony, cue, or the oo in ruby, root, rude, true, suit, chew, soup. So the point here is that once we lay out what the options are for spelling vowel sounds in English, we have many graphemes or representations for phonemes that are letter combinations, not just single letters. So in teaching the system, we need to set the expectation for kids that phonemes, which have a definition and are part of a system, may be represented by letters or letter combinations. And also, letters are not in themselves consonants or vowels. Consonants and vowels are classes of phonemes. Letters, singly and in combination, represent vowels and consonants. So this is where I take issue with many traditional programs of instruction that tell kids that vowels are A, E, I, O, or U, and consonants are the other letters in the alphabet. So by example, let's look at the letter U and how it's used in these words, certainly in put, but, music. The letter U is used to represent a vowel, but in guard, it doesn't represent a vowel. In guest, it doesn't represent a vowel. In quick, it represents a consonant, w. And in the other words, out, ought, author, euphemism, suit, and soup, it works as part of a vowel team to represent vowel sounds. So one of the most fundamental concepts that we need to get across to the people who write programs, textbooks, and all of you who teach, and to kids, is this idea that English, the base layer of English representation, is by phoneme-grapheme correspondences, and we can explicitly map phonemes and graphemes in activities like this, where we give kids words. For example, if we're getting across the difference between a digraph and a consonant blend, we would explicitly show that in the word shrimp, for example, the SH goes in one box. If each box represents a phoneme in the spoken word, that SH goes in one box because it represents one phoneme, but the blends, SHR, which represent two phonemes, and the blend mp on the end, represented by M and P, go in separate boxes because the definition of a consonant blend is that each consonant is sounded even though those consonants are adjacent before or after a vowel in a spoken syllable. So that's the first major concept that has to be respected for instruction to make sense. that the representational system is built on a system of phoneme-grapheme representation, where graphemes are often letter combinations. So English orthography has another layer of complexity, which is that it represents morphology. It is a morphophonemic system. It represents sound, meaning, and function. And let's look at some examples of this. That in our writing system, we preserve the meaningful relationships among words like equal, equality, inequitable, and equanimity by spelling the root, the meaningful root or morpheme in a similar way, even though the pronunciation changes, as in define, definition, definitive, and indefinite. That's a really good illustration of how FIN, for example, changes in pronunciation depending on the phonological structure of the word. But we can look at this word in print and immediately see the meaningful connections among these derivations. And that is an advantage for fluent reading. Divide, division, indivisible, divisive. And way back in my training, I had Carol Chomsky as a professor, and she had us read an article by her husband, Noam Chomsky, and Halla on the fact that English, from their view, was designed as a near optimal orthography because it could represent both sound and meaning, but there were many instances in which meaning, or the preservation of meaning in print, overrode the necessity of representing speech. So here's a little experiment for everyone. I'm going to show something for about a second or two, and I want you to see if you can remember what I've shown you. Ready? Okay, could you remember and repeat that? Probably not. Here comes another one. Now that one might be a little bit easier for a reason I'll identify in a moment. And here's the next one. Oh, what happened there? It didn't take you 2 seconds to recognize and remember what I showed you, because as proficient readers, you already have that word in your mental dictionary, as it were, or you already have that word in your what we call the orthographic word bank or word form area in your brain, and you were able to recognize it when you saw it in print instantaneously. There was no delay there. You did not have to recode it by sounding it out. And what enabled you to do that? What were the building blocks of your instantaneous recognition of this word? Well, we know from exquisite laboratory experiments now that are able to show us how the networks in the brain are built for construction of word memories. We know that when we see a word like beneficial, associations are triggered to the constituent morphemes in the word, in this case, bene, the root F-A-C-E-R-E, which is Latin for to make, and the suffix al, which we also recognize as having a role in showing the grammatical function of the word, which in this case is as a describer or an adjective. We also have broken that word into its syllables. And in order to do that, we've had to recode the phoneme-grapheme correspondences. And these were the building blocks for being able to recognize this word instantaneously. Um, Building a word memory, as it turns out, is essentially a discovery process of understanding these structures of language that are represented in print and building them up over time and elaborating each word memory with more and more information about these aspects of language that are represented in print. Now, I'd like to turn the discussion a little bit to some of the research that informs us about the relationship between speech, or spoken language, and print, and how we learn and what the obstacles to learning word recognition are in reading development. So this is a map of all of the centers across the United States that have been funded by the National Institutes of Child Health and Human Development in the States. This map was put together by Reed Lyon and his office a few years ago. He was head of the reading research program, and I was fortunate enough to be part of this network in the early 1990s and to work with Barbara Foreman on a 5-year project that was conducted in Washington, D.C. and Houston, in which we were charged with showing that if we implemented, quote, the science of reading in high poverty minority schools, low functioning schools, that we could teach the kids how to read, which we did. But that's not what I'm talking about today. I want to point to the work of the Haskins laboratories at Yale University, which were funded around 1970, maybe a few years before that. And this laboratory was the one that gave us concepts and information and research evidence that really changed the understanding of the reading research world. And I'd like to remind everyone of some of the key findings from that lab that are now just accepted science, as I'd like to say. So these are the following: that poor reading and good reading are both, quote, parasitic on speech, as Liberman and Shankweiler stated in 1971. And in essence, they were saying that reading is not primarily driven by visual processes, generic visual spatial learning. Reading depends on language processes primarily. Written words are not learned or remembered, quote, by sight, an insight on their part that has been revisited, reiterated, and reproven over and over again. And I'm thinking of the work of David Scher, the work of Linnea Erie, and many others. So experiments show that word pronunciation is activated in the brain even when we are reading silently and quickly. So there is no such thing as reading that is separate from speech processing. Phonemes are learned and stored in memory by their articulatory properties, not merely their acoustic properties. And conscious analysis of phonemes in words, that is phoneme awareness, is necessary for proficient use of an alphabet. And children's reading and spelling errors are linguistic in nature. And it was this work from the Haskins lab that really influenced me when I was doing my dissertation in 1982, and I could observe directly through spelling error analysis the truth of these statements that they had already made, that vowels are misread and misspelled more than consonants, which points to something other than, quote, visual processing, that similarities in the features of phonemes account for the majority of confusions and errors in reading and spelling. That is, the errors themselves tell us that kids are struggling with aspects of language, not so much the visual features of printed words. And errors are not acoustic or visual, but phonetic. And that is an observation they made because none of the subjects in their early studies had hearing problems or primary problems with hearing. The problems with phonological processing were in what the brain was doing to interpret acoustic input and output. So they ended up saying and concluding this very profound point here, which is that children faced with the task of learning to read in an alphabetic script cannot be assumed to understand that letters represent phonemes, because awareness of the phoneme as a linguistic object is not part of their easily accessible mental calculus, and because its existence is obscured by the physical properties of the speech stream. Now let's pick this apart a little bit, because it is so important for understanding why kids might have trouble with phoneme awareness, how to teach phoneme awareness, and how to connect phoneme awareness to other aspects of language learning, both spoken and written. So what they mean by the physical properties of the speech stream is that when we say words like alligator, animal, and apple, that we tell kids start with the same sound, right? Short A, right? In reality, what the kids are hearing is something a little bit different in each of these words. And we can see with these spectrographs, thanks to Ann Whitney, my colleague here, that when we say alligator, the is blended in with the liquid O that follows it. When we say animal, the beginning is nasalized like and it blends, the features of that vowel blend in with the nasal and spread to the next vowel that follows in animal. So there's no clear division between the vowel and the following consonant. But in apple, there is a clear space, if you will, this white area here between the initial vowel and the stop voiceless stop consonant p that follows it. And therefore, that is why we say in our instruction that apple is a better keyword for representing the sound for kids who are not clear on the identity of this vowel as a building block in the English language phonological system. And it makes a difference which words we use to tell kids about the identity of speech sounds and which words we use in our instruction. And I admit this is a subtle point, but very important if we're going to respect what the Haskins Lab has been telling us for 50 years about what is difficult about phonological processing and phoneme awareness for kids. So another problem for kids is that phonemes are co-articulated or smushed together in spoken words. As you saw from the spectrographs, they are not fully separated in speech. Phonemes are therefore shaped by the phonemes that surround them, and variations of phonemes are called allophones. And our brains are wired to process language so that even though our pronunciations of phonemes take the short A in alligator, animal, and apple, our brains classify those sounds as belonging to the same category of sound, which we recognize as a phoneme within the language system that we know. That's quite a trick that our brains are able to do. We also know that classes or groups of phonemes are distinguished by articulatory features. That is what our mouths are doing, and that has very important implications for instruction. That what kids tend to confuse are phonemes that have similar articulatory features. And when phonemes have similar articulatory features, it is harder for kids to distinguish them. And therefore, our instruction, if it's really refined, will deliberately give practice to kids in separating out those confusable phonemes. For example, we have 3 nasal consonants in English, n, and ng. They're all continuants. They all are made by sending sound through the nose. And they are distinguished by the place in the mouth where they are spoken, with ng being all the way back in the throat. Likewise, we have consonant pairs like ch and j, where the mouth is doing the same thing essentially, except ch is voiceless and j is voiced. And that subtle distinction is something kids could be taught to distinguish with explicit instruction on what these differences entail. So that is why, in my world, it is so important for teachers to learn what the consonant phonemes are if they are teaching English, and this translates to any other language you may be teaching. If you explicitly teach what the speech sound system is, then you have a reference point for teaching what the print is representing. Because this is what kids start with. Kids start with spoken language. That is their reference point when they're trying to learn what in the heck those letters are for. So let's just look at one example here of what there might be to learn if you're a learner of English. There are 5 consonant sounds lined up in the middle of the mouth with the tongue behind the teeth: t, d, n, s, and z. And we'll leave the liquid o out of this for the moment. So t, d, n, s, z. If you say those in order, you can feel your tongue is behind your teeth, and you are articulating each of these, perhaps with voicing or without it, perhaps with continuous sound or a stop sound. But nevertheless, they might feel very much the same in the mouth. So what does this have to do with interpreting kids' spelling errors and learning from them? Well, this is the writing of a first grader, beginning first grader, who's asked to write about things he or she likes. So we have, I like what? I like elephants. I like birds, I like dogs, I like cats, I like kittens. But what's so striking to me here is elephants, and the child has chosen the letter Z for what is a 3 consonant cluster at the end of that word, n, t, s. And this is a very choice because, looking back here, n, t, and s are all lined up in the same place, and the child chose a Z to represent everything that's there on the end of that word, which is very clever. But we can see from looking at where the child is that the child needs to progress from what Airy describes as the difference between an early alphabetic phase of learning and a later alphabetic phase of learning to process the code, in which all of the speech sounds in the spoken word have to be distinguished from one another in spite of the fact that they are smushed together in speech. And what we know about this is that as kids refine their phoneme awareness and are also learning about print, that these 2 processes are reciprocal and inform one another. So as the child gets more exposure to the fact that the word ants, for example, A-N-T-S, has 3 consonants in it, and the more practice the child gets segmenting those sounds orally, and the more progress there can be toward full alphabetic stage processing, and then the progression into true orthographic learning. So there are many examples of this phenomenon of kids approaching the learning of print through their phonological feature and phonological processing mechanism and recognition of phonological features of words, so that, for example, you commonly see in first graders that they'll be writing the initial t in tray with a CH, and that's because there's an allophone there. We shape the mouth for pronunciation of the t in tray, just as we do when we say ch. There really isn't any difference. And we've had experiments from Rebecca Treeman and others that show that at least half the first graders at a certain point will write the sound tray this way, or troubles, or the voice verb dragon, or draw, or drop with the JR, because of the articulatory similarities between those consonants and the affricated t and d in the beginnings of those words. And the same thing in the middle of the word letter or water. Sorry, in the US. In Australia, don't do that, or if you're in the UK, but this is American English dialect where we say letter and water and not letter and water the way you may. So we see a high incidence of spellings like this, which are very smart because the students are showing us that what our mouths are actually doing is pronouncing a middle consonant that is more like d than it is like t. So eventually they have to learn that what we call a tongue flap is to be represented with t or two t's, as the case may be. So there are other aspects of this that we see in spelling errors, such as omission of nasals in words like jump and end, because those nasals are actually swallowed up in pronunciation with nasalized vowels and similar articulation of the final consonants and so on. Let me move on here so I don't run out of time. Okay, so it is really important to me, and I wish everyone did this, to lay out for students, and especially learners of English. Think about the Spanish speaker whose first language has only 5 pure vowels. Well, they have to learn, and we can show them explicitly that in English we have E, A, I, O, U, U, oi, ow, R, and orn. R and or are combinations of sounds that are welded together here. And we have schwa floating in the middle, the indistinct vowel. So we can expect, when we look at this, this is arranged by place of articulation of the vowels. So we can expect that I, and might be confused in kids' early spelling, or they might have trouble learning the difference between and recognizing it for spelling and recalling it for reading because of the similarity in place of articulation of the low middle vowel sounds. For example, even though I is a long vowel sound, when you start saying I, your mouth is in the same open, low open position as it is for and So what would we expect to see? Here in the word chunk, we have the student, this is a first grade student, moving from early alphabetic to later alphabetic phase, writing. Here, the student uses the letter O for the sound in chunk. But I also want to point out that the student makes 2 errors of confusion of voiced and voiceless consonants, writing a P for the B on the end of mob, and writing a G for the final sound in stick. So G and K differ only in voicing. And yet again, this is so fascinating. The student also uses knowledge of the letter G and the sound of the name of letter G to represent the ch in chunk. So J and ch differ only in voicing the sounds, and J and ch are also conflated or associated here with ch on the end of coach, and the student is using j. So the way I read, and in the beginning of dream, the affricated d again comes in here. J, the student may not know j or hasn't learned it, or is thinking, I learned I'm practicing the letter G, and it has the sound J, and so that will do for the first sound of dream. What strikes me about this is how deliberate all these choices are, and how clever the student is, and how the student is using not only their developing phoneme segmentation ability, but also the knowledge of some phoneme grapheme correspondences and knowledge of of all the letter names to kind of come up with strategic spelling of each of these sounds in these words. So sled, we have a C for S. And a C for this in snowing. And this is good. We want kids to, it's okay to teach kids that the letter C is used to represent K and S in the beginning stages of instruction. Kids can handle this. And in fact, that's a truer fact to tell them than what is often done or typically done when we teach kids that each letter has a sound, which is an unfortunate fiction. The importance of phonology for spelling. It's so important for all of us to recognize that learning to spell and learning to read are so closely associated with one another. And it is a dreadful mistake to cast spelling aside as irrelevant, as some people tell me, irrelevant for understanding early reading. And what I found in a study I did with Kassar, Treeman, et cetera, in 2005 was this: phonology, although important for all aspects of literacy, learning is even more critical in learning to spell than in learning to read. Orthographic knowledge is laid over a phonological foundation. If that phonological foundation is weak, orthographic skills cannot develop sufficiently to support good spelling and compensate for the underdeveloped phonological skills. So again, phonological processing is the reference point. It makes both of these code-based activities possible. And if you're not good at it, think about this. If you don't have phoneme awareness, you don't have the anchors or parking spots for those graphemes to be matched to in your orthographic memory. If these anchor points are incomplete or unclear or misidentified, there isn't any Velcro to attach the graphemes to. The result is that students who are attempting to memorize letter sequences by visual imprinting, look at this word and just know it because it means X, Y, or Z. These students are at a real disadvantage because they're trying to use extraneous information, such as configuration around words or context, to do what is essentially a linguistic coding process, and that just doesn't work. So I illustrated this for you. If I show you a random string of letters, as I did the first time, your brain just is going to have a real hard time remembering that, other than through trying to rote memorize a sequence of letter names. It just doesn't work very well. But if you can translate those same letters, if I rearrange them and you can pronounce them, that will help you, even if that doesn't mean anything. And then if you see those same letters rearranged so that they have a connection already established to the morphemes that you know and the meanings you've connected them to, you can instantaneously recognize that letter array as representing a linguistic entity that has sound and meaning. So what evidence is there that when we teach, we need to include encoding with decoding, and that these are two sides of the main coins, of the same coin, and I refer you to a synthesis of studies comparing encoding instruction in first grade with decoding only that Weiser and Mathis did in 2011, and they found effect sizes favoring the inclusion of encoding in beginning reading lessons. That means if you're teaching reading, please include spelling of those same words. The growth impact was significant for phonemic awareness, spelling, decoding, fluency, comprehension, and writing in first graders when this was done. Awareness of the internal structure of words translates into significantly greater sophistication in spelling. Spelling practice in turn affects reading growth. These are relationships that we've known for some time. Encoding requires complete analysis of internal details of a word's phonemes and morphemes, and spelling practice results in higher quality orthographic memories, which in turn, and this is a very recent discovery, which in turn bolsters word recognition speed. So all of this has to do with Perfetti's idea of high quality lexical representations that we're trying to establish in the brain that enhance the speed of word recognition and the accuracy of spelling and reading. And all of this develops over time through stages, as Ari has pointed out. So just concretely, let me say that this has implications for the scope and sequence of what we teach. It should be determined by the features of phonemes, not just the visual similarities of letters or alphabetical order. It should begin with spoken, a lesson should begin with reference to spoken language. What are the sounds? What are the morphemes? How do we say them? How do we pronounce these words in vocabulary and so on? And words, we should proceed from words to sounds to symbols in that order. So we would not say that a consonant is any letter except A, E, I, or U. We would not say that these are vowels. We would say instead, consonant is a phoneme formed by instruction of the flow of air. English has 25 of them. We use certain letters and letter combinations to represent them. A vowel is an open phoneme. English has 15 to 18, depending on what you include. And it can be represented by 1, 2, 3, or 4 letters working as a team or as a group. And there are a few programs out there that respect this principle. One is Janine Herron's work, for example, her Talking Fingers program, a computer-based instructional program. But she has applied something that Pat Vaddisy just did a study on, which is that kids can as easily learn a 2-letter combination for a sound as they can to learn a one letter sound representation. So we're teaching we can teach NG for that sound on the end of wing. And this stands in contrast to something very popular, which I think is extremely misconceived, is that kids are given, all the names of the kids in the class and told to highlight all of the vowels as if it were just the letters that had something to do with spelling, not what they represent. So we can show kids all of this information about speech at the phoneme level. It looks like this in a classroom where a teacher might build a sound wall, we call it, where all of the vowels in English are represented, and then each of their major spellings is taught over time. Of course, you don't throw all this at kids at once because it takes, and some kids need 2 years to learn all this information. So what passes for phonics instruction to me is often very incomplete. It needs to include reference to language of origin, phoneme, grapheme correspondences, the position of a phoneme or grapheme in a word, and letter order and sequence patterns that are peculiar to English, which we didn't have time to address today. And then we should start teaching kids about the meaningful parts of words and how they're represented pretty early in instruction. Now, I am at the end of my time, but I would just say that this principle of speech to print instruction carries through to syntax and discourse processing, which is a whole other talk. We have evidence that methods that emphasize language structure in speech and print are more effective than others, and teachers who know this information better than others get better results. And we have a series of studies showing that. So let me wind up and say that, of course, what I'm implying here is that teacher knowledge of language is critical for informed instruction. That teacher training programs have to include this information about language structure, about basic reading psychology, and research-aligned methods. Still, the science of reading doesn't tell us every detail about how to teach, but if we draw on these basic relationships between spoken and written language, our teaching can be smart and complex. It takes time and lots of learning and coaching. I want to thank all of you who've made this commitment on behalf of our students and our society, because books are the means to immortality. Through them all, we experience other times, other places, other lives, and we manage to become much more than our own selves. Thank you to Anna Quinlan. And now I need to wind up and say thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Moats, for bringing us this knowledge today. You've given us such critical information to inform our practices, just incredibly, incredibly powerful. We really appreciate your time and insights, and thank you to our attendees who tuned in. We have a lot planned today, so we are now going to have a social lunch break that my Amplify colleagues, Karen and Megan, are hosting. We'll be debriefing the session so far and giving out some fun Science of Reading swag. To go there, go to the schedule button in the top left corner and drop down all the way to the social break session. Thanks for watching, and we will see you there.